bear's name was Apollo, and they released him on a Tuesday in March. Dr. Judith Henderson had raised him for 18 months, from a 3-month-old cub found orphaned beside his dead mother, killed by a car on Highway 91, to a 340-pound black bear ready for release into the Cascade Mountains. It was her job, wildlife rehabilitation. She'd done it dozens of times. Bears, cougars, wolves. The protocol was always the same. Minimal human contact, no names, no attachment. Prepare them for the wild and let them go. But Apollo was different, had been from the start. When they'd brought him in, he was starving, dehydrated, covered in ticks. The other rehab specialists said he wouldn't make it. Too young, too weak. Without his mother's milk, without her teaching him to forage, his chances were almost zero. But Judith had tried anyway. Bottle-fed him every 3 hours, slept in the enclosure for the first 2 weeks so he wouldn't be alone. Gradually taught him to eat solid food, to climb, to forage, to fish. She'd broken protocol, given him a name, talked to him. More than she should have, but he'd been dying and she'd been alone. Fresh off a divorce, new to Washington State, working 18-hour days because going home to an empty apartment felt worse than sleeping in a bare enclosure. Apollo had pulled through, grew strong, learned everything a bear needed to know. By month 12, he was climbing trees, fishing in the rehab center's stream, denning properly. By month 15, he barely acknowledged Judith's presence. Exactly what was supposed to happen. But there were moments. When she'd enter the enclosure to check his food stations, he'd pause, look at her. Just for a second, like he remembered, like he was saying thank you before returning to being wild. The release went perfectly. They'd chosen a remote section of the North Cascades. Good salmon runs. Dense forest. No roads for miles. They tranquilized Apollo, transported him in a steel transfer cage, and opened it in a clearing beside a creek. He'd woken up slowly, looked around, tested the air, and walked into the forest without looking back. Standard release. Textbook. Exactly what was supposed to happen. Judith had watched until he disappeared into the trees, then spent the 40-minute hike back to the truck crying. Not because something went wrong, because something went right, because Apollo didn't need her anymore. That was 5 years ago. Judith hadn't thought about Apollo in months. She'd released 16 other animals since then. A wolf pack, 3 cougars, countless deer and elk. You couldn't get attached, couldn't wonder if they were okay, couldn't check on them. That wasn't how rehabilitation worked. But on a Thursday in September, 5 years and 6 months after Apollo's release, Judith got a call from a park ranger named Tom Whitfield. We've got a situation at the McAllister Creek campground. Black bear, male, around 400 pounds. He's been hanging around for 3 days. Not aggressive, but not leaving either. Approaching campers. We're going to have to trank and relocate him if he doesn't move on. Probably food conditioned, Judith said. Someone fed him. Now he associates humans with easy meals. That's what I thought. But this bear is acting strange. He's not going for trash, not raiding coolers. He's just searching, like he's looking for something. Or someone, Judith said. Could be looking for whoever fed him. Maybe. Can you come take a look? We'd rather rehab than relocate if possible. Judith drove out that afternoon. McAllister Creek campground was about 60 miles from where they'd released Apollo. Well within a black bear's range. But the odds of it being him were astronomical. Black bears were common in the Cascades. This could be any of hundreds of males. She arrived at 4 p.m. Tom was waiting at the ranger station. He's down by site 12. Been there since this morning. They walked the path together. Judith saw him before Tom pointed. A large black bear, sitting, not foraging, not sleeping, just sitting at the edge of the campsite, watching people pass by. See what I mean? Tom said. That's not normal behavior. Judith raised her binoculars. The bear was healthy, good weight, clean coat, no visible injuries, and there on his left ear, a small notch. Old, healed over. Her hands started shaking. Apollo had torn his ear on a fence post when he was 8 months old, a distinctive V-shaped notch that hadn't fully healed. She documented it in his release records, but hadn't thought about it in years. "I need to get closer," she said. "Judith, that's not safe. He's a wild bear." "I know, but I think I know him." She walked slowly, hands visible, no sudden movements. The bear watched her approach, didn't run, didn't charge, just watched. At 30 feet, Judith stopped. "Apollo!" The bear's ears went forward. "Apollo, is that you?" He stood. Judith's heart hammered. Black bears standing usually meant a threat display. A warning before a charge, but Apollo didn't lower his head, didn't pop his jaw. He just stood there looking at her, and then he made a sound, not a growl, a chuffing noise, low, soft. The sound cubs make when calling to their mothers. Judith felt tears burn her eyes. "It's you. Oh my God, it's you." She took another step. Tom was saying something behind her, telling her to stop, telling her to back away. But she wasn't listening, because Apollo was walking toward her, slowly, carefully. They met in the middle of the campsite. Judith reached out her hand. Apollo pressed his nose against it, sniffed. His eyes met hers, and she knew. He remembered. 5 years in the wild, 5 years of being a bear, and he still remembered the human who'd saved him when he was dying. "What are you doing here?" Judith whispered. "You're supposed to be miles away, deep in the forest. Why did you come back?" Apollo made that chuffing sound again, turned, started walking toward the tree line, stopped, looked back at her. "He wants you to follow," Tom said quietly. He'd come up behind her, was filming everything. "Judith, this is incredible, but also insane. You can't follow a wild bear into the forest. He's not wild, I mean he is, but he's asking for help. Bears don't ask for help. This one is." Judith followed. Tom followed her, radioed 2 other rangers for backup, against every safety protocol, against every rule of wildlife management. But something was happening, something unprecedented. Apollo led them half a mile into the forest, to a dense section of undergrowth near a stream. He stopped, looked at Judith, looked at the undergrowth, made a different sound, distressed, urgent. Judith pushed through the brush and saw her, a female black bear, smaller than Apollo, lying on her side, barely breathing. Her leg was caught in an illegal trap. Steel jaws had been clamped around her lower leg for what looked like days. The wound was infected, necrotic. The bear was dying. "Oh God," Judith breathed. "Tom, we need the tranq rifle. Now. And call the vet. Tell them we have a critical trap injury." Tom was already running. Judith stayed, knelt beside the female bear, checked her breathing. Her gums were pale. She was in shock. Hours from death, maybe less. Apollo sat 10 feet away, watching, waiting. Judith looked at him. "You couldn't get her out, so you came to find the only human you trusted." He'd traveled 60 miles, through territory he hadn't seen in 5 years. Crossed highways, avoided humans, searched a campground full of people until he found her. Because 5 years ago, Judith had saved his life, and now he needed her to save someone else's. The team arrived, tranquilized the female, cut her free from the trap, stabilized her, transported her back to the rehab center. Apollo followed, stayed just inside the tree line, out of sight but close enough to track them. When they loaded the female into the transport vehicle, Apollo stood at the edge of the parking lot. Judith walked to him, slowly, hands out. "She's going to be okay, I promise. I'm going to take care of her the way I took care of you." Apollo stared at her for a long moment, then turned, walked back into the forest, disappeared. The female bear's name, given by the vet staff, not Judith, was Nova. She'd lost her leg. The infection had spread too far. They amputated below the knee, fitted her with a prosthetic after she healed. Pioneering work, never been done with a black bear before. Nova recovered, adapted to the prosthetic remarkably well. But she couldn't be released. 3-legged bears don't survive in the wild. She became an education bear, living at the rehab center, teaching visitors about conservation, about illegal trapping, about survival. Judith visited her every day, and every evening, just before sunset, she'd see him, Apollo, at the edge of the tree line, watching, making sure Nova was okay. He came every day for 3 months, never approached, never tried to enter the facility, just watched. And then, one evening in December, he stopped coming. Judith told herself it was normal. He'd verified Nova was safe. He'd moved on. Back to being a wild bear. It's what was supposed to happen. But 6 months later, in June, Apollo came back. This time, he had cubs with him. 3 of them, 5 months old, tumbling over each other, playing. And he brought them to the same spot, the edge of the property, where Judith could see them. She watched through binoculars. Apollo sat while his cubs played, and he looked toward the center, toward where Nova was in her enclosure. "He's showing her," the vet said quietly. She was standing beside Judith. "He's showing her his family." Nova was at her enclosure fence. She could smell them, hear them. Her head was up, alert, watching. Apollo stayed for 20 minutes, let his cubs explore, kept them safe, and then led them back into the forest. He came back 3 more times that summer, always with the cubs, always to the same spot, always watching until he was sure Nova had seen them. "It's gratitude," Tom said. He'd been documenting everything, writing papers, giving presentations. Apollo's story had become famous, featured in wildlife journals, national news. He's showing her that he has a family because Judith saved Nova, because Nova survived. But Judith thought it was simpler than that. Apollo was showing Nova she wasn't alone, that even though she couldn't be in the wild with him, she was still part of his world, still connected. The cubs grew. By fall, they were independent. Apollo stopped bringing them, but he still came, once a month, like clockwork, just to check, to make sure Nova was okay. 5 years turned into 6, then 7. Apollo was 10 years old now, older for a wild black bear. He'd survived hunters, harsh winters, territory fights with other males, and he still came back. Other bears had been released from the center. Some had been tracked, some had come back to familiar areas, but none had shown this kind of sustained connection, this kind of memory. Researchers wanted to study Apollo, wanted to collar him, track him, understand how his brain worked, how he maintained this connection across years, how he'd navigated back to Judith after 5 years. Judith refused. "He's wild. He's not a research subject. He's just a bear who remembers kindness and is trying to return it." Last month, Apollo brought someone new, a female, younger than Nova. They sat at the tree line together. Apollo looked toward the center. The female looked at Apollo, like he was showing her something important, telling her a story. Judith watched from the window. "He's teaching her that humans can be trusted, that this place is safe." Tom, who still visited regularly, nodded. "He's passing it on, the knowledge, the connection." Apollo and the new female left after an hour, but 2 weeks later the female came back, alone, and she did something extraordinary. She approached the fence where Nova's enclosure was, sat down, waited. Nova approached from the other side. They couldn't touch. The fence was between them, but they sat there. 2 bears, one wild, one captive, separated by steel but connected by Apollo. The wild bear came back 3 more times. Each time she'd sit with Nova, and Nova, who'd lived in captivity for 7 years, who'd lost her leg and her freedom, seemed calmer, happier, more engaged. "He gave her a friend," Judith said. Apollo gave her someone to connect with. The story spread further. Documentary crews came. Children's books were written. Apollo became a symbol of memory, of loyalty, of the connections between species that science is only beginning to understand. Judith retired last year, moved to a small cabin near McAllister Creek, close to where she'd first found Apollo again. She didn't advertise her presence, didn't seek him out, but he found her anyway. She was sitting on her porch one evening, reading, when she heard movement. Looked up. Apollo was standing at the edge of her property, older now, gray around his muzzle, moving a little slower, but alive, still strong, still surviving. Judith stood, walked to the porch railing. "Hey, old friend," Apollo chuffed, that same sound he'd made when he was a cub. When he'd been dying and she'd stayed with him through the night. They looked at each other, across the years, across the species barrier, across everything that said this connection shouldn't exist. And Judith understood. Apollo hadn't come back to the rehab center all those years ago because he needed something. He'd come back because he wanted to give something, to show that he remembered, that he was grateful, that her kindness had mattered. "Thank you," she whispered, "for showing me that it meant something, that the work mattered." Apollo sat, stayed for an hour, then stood, walked back into the forest. Judith sees him sometimes, never predictably, never in a way she can expect, just occasional glimpses. Him at the tree line, her on her porch. Two survivors who'd saved each other in different ways. The researchers have theories about scent memory, about imprinting, about how Apollo's early contact with Judith created neural pathways that persisted into adulthood, about how trauma bonding, Judith saving his life, created an attachment that overrode normal wild bear behavior. But Judith knows it's simpler than that. Apollo came back because love isn't limited to humans, because gratitude isn't a uniquely human emotion, because a bear who'd been saved remembered the human who'd saved him and spent years trying to say thank you in the only way he knew how. By bringing her his family, by trusting her with his mate, by showing her that the cub she'd bottle-fed at 2 a.m. had grown into something magnificent, something wild and free and strong, he came back to show her that her work hadn't been futile, that the sleepless nights and the broken protocols and the attachment she wasn't supposed to form had resulted in this, in a life lived fully, in cubs raised, in a legacy passed on, released into the wild. 5 years later, he came back, not because he couldn't survive without humans, but because he wanted the human who'd saved him to know he'd survived and thrived and remembered. That's what made it matter. That's what made Judith's entire career worth it. One bear, one connection, one perfect example of how love transcends species, time, and everything science says should separate us. Apollo is 12 now, old for a wild black bear. Maybe 2 more years, maybe less. But when he goes, he'll go knowing he was loved, knowing he returned that love in ways that change lives. Judith's life, Nova's life. The countless people who heard his story and learned that wild animals aren't just resources or threats or data points. They're individuals with memories, with connections, with capacity for gratitude that rivals anything humans can offer. Apollo came back, and in doing so, he taught the world something it desperately needed to learn, that what we put into the world matters, that kindness echoes, that love, once given, never truly ends. It just waits in the forest, watching, remembering, ready to return when the moment is right.